Okay, World Civ. Hey guys, it's snowy day. Oh shoot, something. Um, and I've been having internet problems, so it's not a good excuse. I should have been trying to prepare for this before the weather. I knew we were probably going to miss Monday, so I'm sorry. I should have already posted this stuff. I'm running behind. Even running further behind, I should say, because I was supposed to finish all of this up last Wednesday, looking at the Protestant Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, and the Enlightenment. Your textbook authors deal with the Enlightenment in a separate chapter, but I'm going to deal with it in this one because I think it's so connected to the Scientific Revolution. All right, so finished off talking about the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. One of the big results of the Reformation is going to be increasing tension and warfare in Europe. As your authors noted, there was already a long history of conflict in Europe. We already talked about that as well, that really, since the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 475, Western Europe had been divided into small states, kingdoms, principalities, that were almost constantly at war with each other. For a brief time, in the 700s, Charlemagne had nearly unified the Western Roman Empire, but the empire was divided amongst his heirs upon his death, and the increasing Viking threat, as well as the Magyars, horse riders from Central Asia, led to the creation of that kind of feudalism, that what some people call feudalism. A lot of contemporary European historians call it the F word, because they argue that there's so much variation in medieval Europe that the model of feudalism that was originally developed by historians in the early modern and modern period really doesn't apply very well to everybody equally. There's as many exceptions as there are rules, but for lack of a better term, feudalism, I think, is a useful term to describe the political and economic system in which a warrior aristocracy was granted title over lands in exchange for military service. And again, depending greatly on where in Europe you're looking at, feudalism, these aristocratic lords had varying degrees of legal authority over the local population, as well as the authority to either tax the population and remit a percentage of the taxes to the king, or as landowners to collect rents from the peasant population in order to finance their private armies. So there's a lot of variation in Europe, but the gist is that Europe had, ever since the fall of the Western Roman Empire, been politically fragmented. This fragmentation is just going to get worse with the religious warfare. As we talked about earlier, though, looking at Europe, there had been this increasing centralization of power and authority under kings just prior to the Reformation. So really starting during the Renaissance, kind of accelerating in the 1400s, there was already this trend of kind of new monarchs centralizing power and authority. The Reformation is going to accelerate this as well. The new monarchs are going to be able to use the religious conflicts to centralize more power and authority in their hands. But at the same time, it's going to kind of solidify the political divisions within Europe. And really in the 1500s and 1600s, Europe is going to be racked by religious warfare between Protestants and Catholics, between and between Protestants and other Protestants. So it's going to be some pretty nasty, bloody civil war, or religious warfare, that really comes to a head in the 1600s with the Civil War in England in the 1640s, and the 30 Years' War in the mid 1600s. So the revolt in the Netherlands. The Netherlands was originally part of Spain. Well, originally it was part of the Holy Roman Empire, and under Charles V, he governed Spain as well as the Holy Roman Empire. He divided his empire, though, between his son and nephew before his death. And the Netherlands, though, passed to Philip II, the King of Spain. So Philip is going to, as King of Spain, is also going to rule the Netherlands. The large Protestant population there though, rebelled against Spain. And with the help of England, ultimately Holland gained its independence. Spain did regain control of Belgium, though, what becomes Belgium. And in France, growing tension between Catholics and Protestants led to the St. Bartholomew's Eve massacre in 1572. Initially, Cardinal Richelieu, the kind of power behind the throne in France, had hammered out a compromise with Huguenots, French Calvinists, giving them a degree of autonomy in some areas of France. However, after he'd been able to consolidate power under Louis the 13th, he launched this massacre in 1572, effectively wiping out much of the Huguenot population in France. The Armada, 1588, in response to England's support for the revolt in the Netherlands, as well as the Reformation in England, Philip tried to launch an invasion of England in 1588 that failed because of storms, as well as the response of the English Navy. The Edict of Nantes in 1588 in France stabilizes the situation there. All right, so the 30 Years' War is going to be really the high point of this religious conflict in Europe. There's going to be two big phases, the Bohemian and Danish phase, 1618 to 1629, and the Swedish and French phases from 1630 to 1648. Notice in the Swedish and French, the French were Catholic, but Cardinal Richelieu backs the Protestants against the Holy Roman Emperor to weaken the Holy Roman Empire. France saw the rise of the Holy Roman Empire, particularly under Charles V, when he was also King of Spain, as a threat to France. So long before the 30 Years' War, France had been maneuvering to try to undermine the power of Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, including having a secret alliance with the Ottoman Empire to help the Ottomans fight Charles V and later Philip in the Mediterranean, and ultimately sending French troops into the Holy Roman Empire to help out Protestant forces along with the Swedes to protect the independence of Protestant states. This is one of the bloodiest wars in history in terms of the percentage of the population that gets affected. 30 years, right? So it's a pretty long, brutal war. The civilian population gets targeted by all sides. And estimates are that somewhere between 20 and 30% of the German population in the former Holy Roman Empire, because the Holy Roman Empire dissolves after this, or collapses after this, gets wiped out in this 30-year war period, this 30-year period. So somewhere between 20 to 30% of the population of Germany, which as a percentage is much higher than the percentage of Germans that died in World War I and World War II combined. So World War I, World War II, we'll cover later in the semester. Bloodiest conflicts in the history of the world in terms of total numbers to die in World War I and World War II, devastated Europe, devastated Germany, but as a percentage of the population, a larger percentage of the German population actually died in the 30 Years' War in the 1600s. The civilian population gets targeted, and by and large, there's no reprisals or justice for the civilian population. And what ends up happening then to end the war is the Treaty of Westphalia. This is, politically speaking, the most significant event to come out of the 30 Years' War. This is really what creates the framework for the modern sovereign state system. Now we have nation states. We'll talk about the evolution of nation states after the French Revolution, looking at the 1800s. However, that's really going to be building on this earlier system of the sovereign state. The idea that all states are legally equal regardless of size. So a prince or a republic, as in Holland, they have equal legal rights and standings with other states, such as Poland, Sweden, Denmark, England, France, no matter how small. So a little principality like Magdeburg, Halberstadt here has the same legal status as Eastern Pomeranian or England or France. So the idea of equality of states, that states all have a legal status as sovereign states or sovereign nations, and that they are responsible then for governing inside their own territory without others interfering, right? This was a way to settle the religious warfare. That each state is responsible for governing its own internal affairs, including the religion of the people living in those states. So depending on which state, the prince or the republic, in the case of Holland, they determine what the religion of that population is going to be. And even though this ends the religious warfare in Europe, it is, if you look at the United States or what's going to become the United States, England's colonies in the Americas, this is going to lead to large-scale emigration from areas of Germany to Pennsylvania, and later to some of the other middle colonies when they adopt religious liberty, because Pennsylvania is established with full religious freedom. Protestants from Bohemia, which adopts Catholicism as its official religion, flee to Pennsylvania for religious freedom. So depending on where in the German states, this is all going to be, so the Holy Roman Empire, for all intents and purposes, collapses into a number of small independent states. And so this idea of the independent state emerges from the Treaty of Westphalia. I'm sorry, I'm kind of rambling, repeating myself, but it is hard to understate the importance of the Treaty of Westphalia with regards to the evolution of international law and how states interact with each other. This is going to be a uniquely European legal concept, the idea that all states are equal and sovereign. So there's no imperial authority then, right? So instead, each state is going to be recognized as sovereign and equal. They're responsible for their own internal domestic affairs. So some warfare continues, but largely between sovereign states, largely over issues outside of Europe. Much of the conflict in Europe gets kind of focused outside with competition over colonial empires, like the 7 Years' War, which started off in North America as the French and Indian War between English colonists in Virginia and France over control of the Ohio River. So the idea also that comes out of the Treaty of Westphalia and the dismantling of the Holy Roman Empire is the idea of the balance of power, that France in particular had become engaged or interfered and many of these other powers interfered in the 30 Years' War, which was within the Holy Roman Empire, because they saw a strong unified Holy Roman Empire as a threat to their own nations and their own state interests, particularly if the Habsburg family of the Holy Roman Empire and Spain were unified. That would sandwich France. France would be surrounded, but it would also potentially threaten England, Denmark, Sweden, which is why all these other countries interfere in these religious wars in Denmark, in the Netherlands, and later in the Holy Roman Empire, is to undermine the rising power of the Holy Roman Empire, particularly when it was unified with or aligned with Spain. So the idea is you don't want one power to become one state to become too powerful in Europe, that then they could gobble up the independence of the other states. So the idea you need a balance of power to maintain this sovereign state system. And that's going to be, this kind of balance of power is tenuous, but it's going to hold until Germany unified, or reunified, I should say, because the Holy Roman Empire was largely German states. When Germany unifies in 1870, that's going to start to undermine the balance of power and lead to World War I and World War II. Innovations, military technology, talked about this earlier. Things like pikes, the English longbow, crossbows had helped contribute to centralizing power and authority of kings, but especially gunpowder weapons. Artillery is really expensive, so only the wealthiest princes or kings can afford to have field armies with lots of artillery, which of course is great for destroying the castles of nobles, but also to mass produce and equip armed professional soldiers with muskets. I showed a picture earlier of the arquebus, the early shoulder-fired, man-portable first kind of musket. That technology is going to improve during the 30 Years' War, and tactics to effectively use it on the battlefield. The Swedes were the first ones to introduce the concept of volley fire, where instead of having small units of musket-equipped troops interspersed with the rest of your troops, you have a large number you have all of your musket-armed troops concentrated into one formation, and they fire in volley into the enemy. that the first rank fires, kneels to reload. The second rank fires over their heads. They kneel to reload. The third rank fires over the heads of the first two ranks. They kneel to reload. The fourth rank fires over the heads of the first three rows, and they don't need to kneel and reload, because after they fire, the first rank is reloaded. They stand up, they fire, kneel back down. The second rank stands up, they fire, they kneel back down. The third rank stands up, fires, they kneel down to reload. The fourth rank fires, they start to reload. When the first rank fires, stands up, and they refire. So kind of continuous volley fire is really going to make muskets, individually portable gunpowder weapons, effective on the battlefield for the first time. And by the end of the 1600s, flintlocks had replaced matchlocks as a much more reliable form of musket. So new military technology and new military tactics are really going to thrive during this roughly 100-year or 150-year period of religious war in Europe. So remember, the Protestant Reformation started in 1517, and it's really not going to be until 1648 that the religious wars end. So it's going to be a good 140 years or good 130 years of religious warfare in Europe. And even after that, as I mentioned, there's still going to be continuous wars between the powers, largely though in their colonial empires, but in Europe as well. All right, so coming out of these new state systems, we're going to see two models emerge. Absolute monarchies. The idea that kings are God's political representatives on earth. This idea really takes shape in its fullest form under Cardinal Richelieu in France. He is the advisor to King Louis XIII. And even though he's a Catholic cardinal, he's very much in favor, puts the interests of the French state ahead of the Catholic Church. So even though he's an official in the Catholic Church, his first loyalty is to France. And he really works behind the scenes, behind Louis XIII, to destroy the power of the nobles. They use the new technology of gunpowder weapons to destroy the castles of the nobles and to crush their conspiracies, using professional soldiers being paid cash wages with gunpowder weapons. They just crush the nobility. They build a bureaucracy which recruits from the commoner class, particularly the emerging middle class, to bolster the power of the crown. They don't need to rely on aristocrats for the bureaucracy. They're going to recruit bureaucrats from the middle class to kind of bypass the aristocracy. And they ruthlessly attack Calvinists. They use the religious warfare against Protestants as justification to expand the power of the king. Under Louis XIV, Louis XIII's son, the power of the king really reaches its height in France up until the French Revolution. He said, l'état c'est moi, the state is me. His father, Louis XIII, had built a vast palace in in Paris, the Louvre, which is now, of course, the largest art museum in the world. The Louvre was built by Louis XIII to house himself in his court. Louis XIV decided it wasn't big enough. He needed a bigger palace. So he moved to Versailles, which is a suburb of Paris, to build what became the largest building in Europe. 1,400 fountains, 25,000 fully grown trees transplanted because he couldn't wait for them to grow. Just the stables for Versailles were larger than the next largest palace in Europe, or the Buckingham Palace in England. So Louis the 13th, Louis the 14th stables were bigger than Buckingham Palace in England. So he encourages the aristocracy, puts pressure on them to come move to Versailles. The reason he wants this palace to be so large is so that the most powerful aristocrats in France can all come live in his house. They have to ask permission to go back to their estates in the countryside. And when they go, Louis puts pressure on them to keep their families at Versailles. The idea that if they're leaving Versailles to go to the countryside with their families, they're up to no good. They may be rebelling. So in effect, Louis keeps their families hostage in Versailles. This prevents them from rebelling. But also, he wines and dines them and entertains them. Versailles becomes a lavish playground for the high aristocracy of France to keep them too drunk and oversexed to be worried about rebelling. So on one hand, he keeps them busy partying so that they can't rebel. On the other hand, they are very much under his thumb, with their families being kept as hostage at Versailles when they go to the countryside to manage their estates. We'll talk about Japan later and the Tokugawa system, the system of Sankin Kotai, alternate attendance, in which the shoguns of Japan do a similar policy to control the aristocracy in Japan by requiring them to live in the capital and to keep their families in the capital as hostage when they go to the countryside to manage their country estates. So some interesting parallels between what Louis the 14th does and what the first shoguns in Japan do in the 1600s in Japan. The French model then becomes the French system then becomes the model for other monarchs, like in Russia. Peter I, Peter the Great, tries to work on modernizing Russia on Western grounds, particularly to build a modern army and navy. There's some differences, though, between absolutism in Russia and in France. One of the things that Peter does, and later Catherine does, builds on to kind of prevent rebellion amongst the boyars, the aristocracy of Russia, was to guarantee employment for their children, either in the bureaucracy or in the military, as officers or bureaucrats. So unlike France, where Cardinal Richelieu adopted a policy of recruiting bureaucrats from the middle class, Peter is going to recruit bureaucrats from the aristocracy, as well as guarantee the much more prestigious officer jobs in the military. So Peter starts modernizing the Russian military, builds a new capital at St. Petersburg, which will be the home for the Russian Navy. One problem, though, for Peter and later Russian czars is that St. Petersburg is not ice-free year-round. So for several months out of the year, it's too cold for the Navy to operate. So starting with Peter then, the Russian czars are going to look to expand south and east in order to not just gain more territory, but also to get access to warm water ports on the Black Sea, with the ultimate goal of expanding into the Mediterranean into Central Asia to try to move in towards the Indian Ocean, and of course to the west with their maritime provinces on the Pacific, in order to create not only a large land-based empire with the goal, though, of becoming a modern naval power to challenge the preeminence of England and the English Navy. So Catherine II, also known as Catherine the Great, furthers this military expansion, partitions Poland from 1772 to 1797. The Austria, Hungary, Russia, and Prussia divide Poland up so that by 1797 there was no longer an independent Poland. Much of what was the Kingdom of Poland particularly gets divided by the newly emergent Kingdom of Prussia, which emerges as one of the most powerful of the German states after the Treaty of Westphalia, and Russia. Also starts trying to implement social reforms, but those end with Pugachev's rebellion, and in fact, after Pugachev's rebellion, in order to gain more support from the Russian aristocracy, she not only stops trying to institute social reforms to free the Russian peasants or serfs, but actually implements or reverses course and implements laws that effectively turn the Russian serfs and peasants into virtual slaves of the Russian aristocracy. So initially she moves to try to free them a little bit more. Ultimately she makes their lot even more legally tied to the aristocracy. All right. Oh, I don't have the Republican systems. Something your authors, I need to modify this. I'm sorry. Your authors, I was confused when I saw this pop up because your authors talk about constitutional monarchs. And this goes all the way back, has its roots in England, particularly the rebellion against King John and the signing of the Magna Carta. King John was left a kingdom in debt by his much more famous and popular brother Richard, and tried to raise taxes to pay for this debt, but also to raise armies to defend his lands in France, like the other Plantagenets in his family. John was born, John was born in England. He was the first English king to actually be born in England and not in France, of the Plantagenet family, and spent more time in England than any of his family. But that spurred his attempts to raise taxes led to a rebellion amongst the aristocracy, and they forced him to sign the Magna Carta, which gave the aristocracy of England the right to form a parliament, from the French word parler. They all spoke French. The English aristocracy largely spoke French, not English, and so parliament was from the French word parler, and gave themselves then a sole power to raise taxes in England. So the English kings could request Parliament raise taxes, but ultimately it was the power of Parliament to raise taxes, not the king, and to pass laws of spending. So finances were given to the aristocracy. I'm trying to remember if it was Henry the Third, Henry the Second or Henry the Third, Edward the First's grandson, Edward's Longshanks. When he started to try to raise more professional armies, principally relying on English longbowmen, he extended or expanded Parliament to include the gentry, freemen who owned their own land but weren't aristocrats. England had a much higher population of freemen who owned land but weren't nobles, weren't aristocrats. So technically, they're not really peasants because they own their own land. They're gentry. They own their own land, but they're not warrior aristocrats. So they're the ones who really have the economic independence then to become the foot soldiers in these professional armies that the English kings were trying to raise. So since also to raise the money, he started to have to raise taxes. So he created the House of Commons so that all landowners, whether aristocrats or not, could vote on whether or not to raise taxes. So that lower house, the House of Commons, was created in Parliament as part of this drive in England to raise more professional armies to circumvent reliance on the aristocracy, on this kind of feudal landowners to provide troops. So that kind of provided the model, and that's one of the reasons why the Tudor kings and why Elizabeth, the Tudor queen, was so financially constrained with regards to exploration and colonization in America, was because Parliament controlled the finances, controlled taxes and revenue. However, this also became kind of a model or this kind of constitutional monarchy for the Netherlands. When the Netherlands or Holland gained its independence from Spain, they also created a constitutional monarchy and a republican system of government. So these provide kind of separate examples or different examples than in these absolute monarchs. The English Civil War in the 1640s was triggered by efforts by James II, Charles I, to raise taxes without consulting Parliament. He was also sympathetic to Catholics. He had a Catholic wife and was sympathetic to Catholics. So I had appointed several Catholics to government office, and that led to rising tensions between the king and Parliament, particularly the Puritans in Parliament, the Calvinists in Parliament. So in 1639, Charles I tried to dissolve Parliament and govern without Parliament. That led to a rebellion, and some of the aristocracy and most of the House of Commons raised an army to overthrow the king. And for 10 years, the forces of Parliament and the forces of the king and the royalists ravaged England in a brutal civil war. Ultimately, the parliamentarian forces were triumphant and arrested Charles I, tried him for treason. This is an age of absolute monarchs. James was very much jealous of the power of his cousin in France, of Louis the 13th and Louis the 14th. Why can't he rule as an absolute monarch like Louis? Well, not Louis the 14th, because Charles was dead by then. But he wanted to rule like Louis. He would have been alive still, because he lost his head in 1649. So he wants to rule as an absolute monarch like in France. His efforts to do so lead to a civil war, and ultimately he gets his head chopped off. For a while, Parliament tried to rule without a king. The parliamentary general, Oliver Cromwell, who was a Puritan, was appointed protector of the realm, and increasingly in the 1650s ruled as a puritanical religious tyrant or dictator. They closed down all of the playhouses, all of the theaters in England, all of the bars, all of the brothels and whorehouses, made it illegal to gamble in England, made it illegal to be publicly drunk, made it illegal, made adultery or sex outside of marriage a crime. They created a religious police force, almost like the Taliban, to enforce these strict moralistic codes in England. And after Cromwell died, the majority of Parliament decided this was going too far, and they invited Charles I's son, Charles II, to come out of exile from France and create a balance between Parliament and the monarchy. The idea that if the king tries to rule without Parliament, that becomes a tyranny. If Parliament tries to rule without the king, then you get another kind of tyrant with Cromwell. So you need a balance of power in government between Parliament and the king, between the legislative branch and the executive branch. Charles II was happy to kind of observe this balance of powers between the monarchy and Parliament. He went on to seize the Dutch colonies in North America, establish New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania, started fighting a series of wars with the Dutch over control of trade in the Indian Ocean and in the Pacific. But by and large, at home, let Parliament kind of run things in England. His son, James II, though, didn't seem to have learned anything from his grandfather's mistakes. And James II once again tried to expand the power of the monarchy to increasingly rule as an absolute monarch in the 1670s. So in the 1680s, Parliament rebelled against James II. They waited till he was outside of London, visiting one of his country estates, to pull off a coup. They invited his sister Mary and her husband William of Orange from Holland to come take his place. They were Protestants, and they forced them to sign the English Bill of Rights, which built on the Magna Carta by clearly stating that only Parliament has the power to raise taxes, because only Parliament represents the people, because they're elected by the people. Even though only 15% of the male population in England owned enough property to vote, they were still elected. So the idea of no taxation without representation was created with the Glorious Revolution in the early 1680s in England, and the English Bill of Rights, which limited the power of the monarchy, really enshrining the idea of a constitutional monarch in England. And later it's going to become part of the inspiration for the American Revolution. All right. I'm looking at the time. I'll finish up looking at some of these other changes. There's rapid population growth. Remember, the Columbian Exchange led to improved diets in Europe. And also better nutrition, larger quantities of food, but also better nutrition because of a greater variety of food. So not only does people's caloric intake increase and reliability of a food source increase, so less liable to suffer famines in cold winters, but also the nutrition improves because of the balance in their diet. As a result, people become more resistant to disease as well. Bubonic plague doesn't completely go away, but the population becomes more resistant. So you can see this huge population growth. So 1500, beginning of the Columbian Exchange, population in Europe was about 80 million. At the high point of the bubonic plague, though, population in Europe had been reduced to somewhere between 40 and 50 million people in Europe at the height of the Black Death. So you can see that even by 1500, Europe's population had rebounded from the Black Death quite a bit. By 1700, Europe's population had increased by about 40%. And by 1800, had more than doubled from 1500. Much of this population then gets concentrated in cities. And there's growing poverty and unemployment in cities in Europe. The colonies in the Americas provide somewhat of an outlet, particularly in England, for the urban poor to move to the colonies for better opportunities, usually as indentured servants. Also, as a way to deal with growing crime in cities, attendant with this growing population and poverty and unemployment, criminals were often sentenced to indentured servitude in the colonies. So the urban population really starts to take off. So 1550, there's no city in Europe with more than 150,000 people. I think I misspoke then when I was talking about Tenochtitlan. Remember, Tenochtitlan, when Cortez arrived in 1519, the capital of the Aztec Empire, had 250,000 people, had 250,000 people. At the time, Paris had only a little over 100,000 people. So by far the largest city in Europe was less than half the size of Tenochtitlan. By 1650, though, London had emerged and Paris had emerged as the two largest cities in Europe, each with about 500,000 people. And this growing population is going to lead to economic changes. As your authors point out, there had always been merchants going back to the earliest civilizations, people trying to make money by buying and selling goods. The most basic definition of capitalism then is really just using money to make more money, investing your money to make more money, either through commerce or trade or other avenues. However, capitalism as we know it really starts to explode in this early modern period with new kind of financial institutions and the beginning of industrialization, where individuals or companies can own the means of production. So owning factories rather than individual artisans manufacturing things. Private initiative, not government control, is going to drive a lot of this. And with a growing population, there's a growing demand for products. So supply and demand determines prices. Of course, this is going to be what the kind of natural laws of economics that Adam Smith describes. So new economic system, banks. The idea of banks really developed in the Middle East and in East Asia during this period of Mongol trade and peaceful trade throughout the Mediterranean, the early Renaissance. The system of banking spreads to Europe as well, that you don't need to carry all your gold with you if you're on a business trip. You can deposit your gold in a bank and you can get a letter of credit from the bank that you can exchange at a branch bank in a distant city and withdraw funds from that other bank. Stock exchanges. This really starts to develop the first idea of stock exchanges in the Mediterranean trade, investing in stock in business ventures that you can't, if you might not be able to afford to buy a ship and buy a whole shipload of spices from the Eastern Mediterranean, but you could help buy stock in that voyage and then get some of the profit. Buying and selling stock, and the idea of the joint stock company. The joint stock company first originated with maritime insurance. The risk of losing ships could be financially crippling to a merchant. Insurance companies developed as a way to insure losses on these overseas ventures. But in order to raise the money necessary to cover these losses, the insurance companies would sell stock in the company to investors. And those investors would only be liable for the loss of their initial investment. So if I invest $100 in a maritime insurance company, and that company goes bankrupt, I'm only liable for the loss of that initial investment. However, I get a percentage of the profits. And because merchants buy insurance on their ships, and more ships don't sink than do sink, insurance becomes very lucrative and profitable. This becomes a model for other types of business. Things like the English East India Company, the VOC, to fund these voyages of exploration. Because again, starting with both England, but also in Holland, these republican systems of government, these constitutional monarchies, have very limited financial power themselves, so they rely on the private sector. Also start to see the development of the putting out system. This has nothing to do with dating on a Friday night. This has to do with putting the raw materials for production in farm households. That medieval guilds had really monopolized production, particularly of the textile industry. And in exchange for labor, the guilds would hire craftspeople to work as apprentices and journeymen, and they would fix prices, fix quantities, and fix quality in the local market. So guarantee profitability for all of the guild members. And it was also the guilds then that served as the town councils in many of these medieval cities that were chartered by kings or other major nobles. But that limits production and it fixes prices. So if you're a merchant, you want to find a way around these guilds to get a lower cost. So the way to do that is to take wool and spinning machines and give them or provide them to farm families who can spin thread or weave cloth in their home and are paid by the yard. So they're paid so it's piecemeal pay, and that way you can get around the guilds. So rural life, farmers, improved access to manufactured goods, improves quality of life, standard of living, increasing opportunities in urban centers, working in trade and commerce. And ultimately then, serfdom is going to be abandoned for free farming or peasant farming. And increasingly, nuclear families replace extended families, particularly in urban areas. Also, gender changes as women start entering the workforce. They gain more economic independence. And we're going to see this is going to become one of the seeds that grows into the women's movement. But that'll be much later. All right, moving on to the scientific revolution. I'll do this as a scientific revolution and enlightenment as a separate lecture. I'll go ahead and try and post this. It might take a while to upload because internet's been spotty. But hopefully this will help you guys catch up and keep up. Thanks a lot. See you later.